Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm Sally Ganga from College Coach, and I'm really excited about today's show. If you're actually watching this on video, you'll see that I'm here for my first segment with Jameer Abney, Coordinator of Outreach for Opportunity and Inclusion at Colgate University. That's a mouthful, but I think it's descriptive, so that's good. Jameer and I will be discussing affirmative action, what it is and what it means for applicants. And I want to be really clear that we're also talking about what it means for students who are not sort of going to be admitted under affirmative action, so to speak. So I really hope that everybody listens in on this so that you get a full understanding of how it impacts college admissions, because honestly, the impact is a lot less than most people seem to think. But before we get to that, I want to describe my other segments today. The second segment is going to be with Joy, College Coach Educational Consultant. She and I are going to be holding office hours addressing how students who haven't yet applied to college can still do so. And yes, there is still time, not for the most selective colleges, but there is still time. And so for the third segment, Chrissy Foran, Finance Consultant with College Coach, will be explaining what you need to know about financial aid and merit award letters from colleges. So welcome, Jameer.
Hi, welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being on here. And I'm really grateful because I think that there really is just so much confusion about what affirmative action is, how it impacts students, So I really would love to have you just start with kind of a basic definition of what is affirmative action.
Yes, no problem. So if you've heard the term affirmative action, it goes back several decades here in the US in the college admissions process. And basically, it is a way for us on the admissions side to consider equity in the education process and really think about students coming from different backgrounds, whether it's how they identify racial and ethnically, gender, religious background, international students, et cetera, and just to account for those nuanced differences and what their experience might have been, and take that into account when we're reviewing applications. And you hear the term holistic admissions, and that's really thinking about just looking at all the different factors and using that in the decision.
Mm-hmm. So kind of in the same way that a student from North Dakota might actually be admitted affirmatively, so to speak, because there's so few students from certain states with low populations that maybe that student has a little easier time than a student, at least standing out, than a student from California. Is that kind of one way to think about it? Feel free to disagree, by the way.
Yeah, if you consider geography, like where a university is located and where they typically see their students coming from across the United States, and definitely thinking about things like, hey, we don't have very many students from this area. The students are interesting, they fit within our academic profile, they jump out more than a student that's, say, right here in your backyard.
Absolutely. All right. And so I want to clarify something right away because I run into this all the time. So it doesn't sound like affirmative action means quotas, that colleges are not being told you have to bring in 10% class of students of color. Nothing like that's going on.
No, not at all. They're not like a number of designated spaces, a quota, or a number of seats for students. It's more so thinking about broad picture, how you're looking at students from different locations, again, different identifiers, and just trying to be more equitable in that process, given the different demographics and personality traits, academic traits, et cetera, that students are bringing with them into the application process.
But those other traits are never going to weight more than like academic qualifiers, for example. I mean, students always have to be academically qualified, no matter who.
Correct. If a student, we don't feel like they're going to be able to do the work and aren't going to be able to be successful, ultimately that's important to us first, and
Mm-hmm.
wanting to make sure that also we're have the resources to allow them to be able to be successful. And you hear people talk about fit as part of that conversation, and so it could be like thinking about academic fit and where they're coming from, but also the social and resource support that's available on a campus to ensure that student that might be coming from a very unique demographic or geographical background, and it's going to be a big transition, is the university providing what they need in order to be successful? That's part of the conversation too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting is when I talk to families about this, they sort of always go first to affirmative action as sort of a reason their kid didn't get in, and there's not usually the discussion of um, And I'm not criticizing colleges for doing this, but for example, athletes have a much bigger kind of thumb on the scale, if you will, in terms of meeting, being allowed to meet kind of less of an academic criteria. And I think that became really clear with the varsity blues scandal, like how much of an advantage an athlete, a recruited athlete, I want to be very clear, only if you're recruited, might have. So with affirmative action, so to speak, it's really kind of a lighter thumb on the scale. It's just one of sort of many of these broad criteria that you're talking about. Would you say that that's accurate?
I think it's different. Like you said, recruited athletes, a different community, a different recruitment process than what the general student will go through. I think when you're talking about athletics, it does present a unique challenge, but also a lot of times people are thinking about Division I, bigger schools, the schools we see on TV and NCAA athletics versus
Hmm.
say a smaller school that's an NC2A Division III program or NAIA, which is a different system than the NC2A. So different things to think about where something like athletics will fit, but also conversations when you think about factors in the admissions process. Is a student a legacy coming from a family where they've had parents or grandparents that have gone to the school? Is a student coming from a demographic or socioeconomic background where they can afford to pay full tuition and fees? And what does that add to the conversation? So lots of different factors when you think about kind of putting that tip on the scale of where they fall in terms of their ability to be more competitive in the process, and all things that we on this side have to think about in a holistic admissions review to be sure we're being as equitable as possible.
And anybody who's listened to this show should know basically what holistic admissions means, but essentially it means these more selective colleges are looking at a variety of different factors. They're looking definitely at the transcript. That's always the cornerstone. The test scores, if they are required and or provided in a test optional situation, but looking at teacher recommendations, looking at activities, looking at the kind of essay the student wrote, all to figure out, is this student going to be a good, as you said, it fit for this institution? What are they going to bring to the institution, as well as what are they going to get out of the institution? So I was wondering if you like, I don't want you, obviously, a lot of the work you do is confidential and that's as it should be, but I was wondering if you could kind of take us through like an example or two of how it might work in the committee process. Is that something that you might be able to do? Like give some kind of specific examples of some of the competing interests that you might be thinking out about with any given candidate?
So, like, this is different depending upon institution, what that might look like. Obviously, one of the cool things a lot of colleges will do now is actually go through case studies with students and allow them the opportunity to kind of be an admission officer in practice is something we've done with parents, with alumni, with our own
Hmm.
student interns as well this year as part of their training process to kind of better understand what it is that we do. I think if thinking about a committee conversation, you brought up a varsity athlete, for example.
Hmm.
And so you have a student that's maybe a recruited athlete, but do they fall at a level where there is concern about their academics, or have they not taken a certain level of courses, even within that conversation where coaches, recruiters may be really interested, but there's concern? That may be something that you bring to the table, or you have students where you talk about geography earlier and being interested in bringing more students from a particular state where you don't see them, but then having to have a conversation around, okay, the student is from this place, but maybe they're too much like most of the students we typically see in terms of other demographic factors. Maybe it's a conversation about a student who, from a socioeconomic background perspective, there's like, hey, the student is from North Dakota, but they're not as interesting as this student from, say, New York, who's bringing a more diverse background or a different and unique approach than what we typically see in our wider student body. So there are definitely a lot of different things that you kind of push and pull and weigh when you're looking at students. Even if they bring one factor, there may be something that you say, well, this there's some other interests in other places when you're starting to think about kind of building the full class. But I think one of the great things is a lot of it is taking within the context of their school, where they're coming from, and really trying to compare them to students who are within their demographic and coming from a similar place, similar high school or the same school if you have multiple applications, versus trying to look at students who just you can't really compare the apple to the orange in one way when you think about completely different. types of students, types of communities and experiences, but definitely wanting to be conscious of at the end when you're building the class and you're thinking about your community, are you offering your students the opportunity to grow and continue to develop as young people? And as they go into their adult life, to take that with them into the world as they represent your institution in one way or another.
Hmm. And I think what hopefully is coming across here is just how complex the entire process is. I mean, just overall, there's so many different competing interests. And so it can be really challenging, like when I'm talking to people to try and explain why it isn't any one thing. So I was wondering if, and let's talk about like, how, I mean, we've already, I think, touched on this, but do you have any kind of a sense of what percentage of colleges have affirmative action, like just in kind of a general rule? I mean, I don't know the exact percentage, but my sense is that it's really, well, I'm quite confident that it's a very small minority of colleges actually. So what's your take on that?
I think that's hard to say because I don't know that it's like something you'd see like on the admission page somewhere, or something
Mm-hmm.
that's like externally visual or communicated out. But at least my understanding, especially for any place that's talking about a quote holistic review, that's everybody, because you're taking into account a lot of different factors when you're looking at all the different parts of an application. And
Mm-hmm.
also because of the legal background of the term affirmative action and the cases that go with that, if you look at the history of it, there's some level of responsibility to think about equity in the process. And so different ways that colleges and universities are doing that and different things that take that into account.
Mm-hmm.
But anytime I think you're saying the word holistic or hearing admission officers talk about a holistic review, they're considering all of the different factors, which I think affirmative action feeds into that.
Mhm. I think that's a really good way to think about it, and I think people don't realize, I mean, there's around what, 4,000 four-year colleges, and the fact is that most of them admit the vast majority, and so they might not be doing really holistic admission. And then there's institutions like when I worked at Whittier, we did holistic admission for honestly a fairly small group of students because most of the students were qualified and would just get in. So that's the other piece too, is that even if you have holistic admission, in general, probably there are colleges where a majority of the students are just going to get in, and there's just a quick scan for any red flags in the essay or in the recommendations, anything that might be concerning, right? And of course, most students don't have those things. So then they go, straight to admission. So, um, yeah, so I think that that is really important to note. What what do you think, like, if you're talking to people about affirmative action, like, what do you think is always the most important thing to them for them to know about it?
I think one of the biggest things is, as you go back and forth and look at again, kind of the legal cases, is who it's ended up helping the most versus who it was kind of, I guess, initially designed for. And that there are still, when you think about diversity along racial and ethnic lines, lots of things that we're still trying to do to continue to be more diverse and be more equitable in our processes as college admissions counselors. And so within that, it's created a lot of conversation around, well, did this meet kind of the goal that it was intended to, for students from diverse and racial ethnic backgrounds versus students that are maybe gender, women versus men in the college admissions process, or students who are coming from different income backgrounds and other
Mhm.
other types of demographics that you can take into account. So there continues to be conversation around, in a process like, are we accounting for all of the right things and truly being as equitable as we want to be?
Mhm. So who could you give us a brief history lesson? I know it's tough to do in just a few minutes, but we do have a few minutes left, so I'd love to hear.
Well, some of the conversation is around men and women in the process, and women being given access early on. And there's been conversation around students who identify as Asian American and where they fit in the process. And then conversation as you get into more different demographic, racial, and ethnic groups. I think more recently, access. When we talk about that, you're thinking about Black students and African American students, Hispanic and Latino students, more so in that process, the most underrepresented groups. When you think about higher education, Native American, Alaskan Native students as well. And so it kind of get down a rabbit hole when you
Hmm.
start to think about it, because the data shows that in general, it's women who have been most successful in that process. When a lot of the bigger conversation at times is about race and ethnicity within who's being admitted, and so it creates a really tough push and pull, I think, to say, okay, is this actually doing what we set out to do? But also, are there other things in the process that we can do to just get more of those students in the pool?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, what's going to benefit, I think a piece that a lot of people don't realize too is I read a study, and I'm not able to kind of get the exact details right, but it said something like students who are in the lowest 25% in terms of income, often underrepresented students of color who are at the very top of their class have less chance of going to college than students who are in the very bottom but who are well off. So, in other words, the strongest students who are low income are far more disadvantaged in terms of getting into college, um, than the very weakest students who are at the higher levels of income. Is that information that you've come across as well?
I don't know that I've seen that direct study, but it doesn't necessarily surprise me, because we think about just access to resources and understanding like how to get to college. If you're coming from a family where that's prevalent or resources are prevalent, then you may be thinking about that sooner than the student who's coming from a tougher income background, lower income background, less resources, maybe a school where you have a counselor that has a load of over 100 students that they're trying to manage. You may just not be getting that one-to-one support. You may not be being introduced to colleges and universities early. People like me may not be visiting your high school and talking to you about those options. So, but I think one of the great things is you see things like community-based organizations, national programs like a Quest Bridge Scholar Program, Posse Scholars, those types of things, to try to introduce that to students sooner and get them thinking about their post K through 12 options and what's available to them, which for some students, college may not be the fit. It may be technical school or technical programs or other types of
Mhm.
programs that allow them to be successful and build the type of life that they're looking for. It doesn't mean you have to end up at a 4 year college or university, but understanding your options is one of the things that we continue to work on and just help students see everything that's out there.
So I think this is a really great point that you're making. I love that you brought up some of these organizations that can help students. Like if we have somebody listening right now who thinks, I want to help my son or my daughter go to college, my student is in ninth grade, like what are agencies or organizations I can go to get help since at my high school the counseling staff, my student is one of 400. I mean, which is literally the case at some high schools, some public high schools. So where would you point a student to who might need a little help?
I think first you want to look in your backyard. Are there regional or city-based organizations near you that you can work with? I know a lot of colleges actually have these programs that lead back into their local community. So maybe the local community college or a local four-year institution, asking the counselor if they know of these community organizations. Sometimes see things like through like a local YMCA or through the city government or the county government offering resources and programs that they might do. So I think just asking questions of leaders in your local community, teachers, people who are out in the community doing service or other types of outreach can be really useful. Some of those national organizations are much more competitive and harder to get in touch with. But if you have something in your backyard, that can be kind of your stepping stone into some of those opportunities. And especially if you have even a 2 year college nearby, they may allow you to dual enroll and take courses there and add to your capability and preparation. Or they might have a program that allows students to get support, advising, and mentorship to get them to the 4 year university they might be interested in.
Hmm. Okay, great. I mean, we have 2 minutes left if you want it, or we can move on. So just any last things you want to close with? This has been great.
I think one of the biggest things is when you think about the term affirmative action or you look at the admissions process, is like you said, it's complicated. And there isn't one thing or another that's the reason why you didn't get in where you wanted to get in, or you are being admitted to the place that you're interested in. And I think ultimately for students, when you start down the pathway, have a wide net, look at a lot of different places, ask a lot of questions, talk to students at the colleges you're interested in, and people like me who I'm a first year college grad. I hadn't gone through this process. I didn't intern in my admission office. I ended up at a college I had never heard of before I was a junior in high school. And now I do this work. And there are lots of people like me who are in this field because they want to give back and they want to be those representatives. And so look for people like me, look for people who are doing diversity recruitment, who have positions that are focused on that type of outreach, who work with the organizations like the ones I talked about, because we can be the people that, even if it's not our college or university, we might be able to point you in the direction to another institution or other resources that can help you get there if that's something you're really passionate about.
Mhm. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jameer. I really, really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Okay. All right. So we're going to be taking a short break, but when we return, Joy and I will be giving advice to seniors who haven't yet applied to college.